"Wait, don't move." Those were the first words the frightened waitress heard before a complete stranger grabbed her by the waist, pulled her close, and kissed her right in the middle of the diner. Her heart nearly stopped. She tried to push him away, but his grip tightened just enough as he whispered against her ear, "You're in danger, pretend you're my lover." Before Maddalena could even ask what he meant, the front door slammed open. Three enormous men carrying baseball bats stormed inside, their furious eyes searching every corner of the restaurant. The terrified waitress froze. She had never seen them before, yet the hatred burning in their faces made her blood run cold. Then something unbelievable happened. The moment those men recognized the stranger kissing her, they stopped dead in their tracks. Their confidence vanished. Even the man leading them lowered his bat. Because the stranger holding Maddalena wasn't an ordinary customer. He was Federico Filippo, the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago. A man whose name alone made hardened criminals think twice before pulling a trigger. But what nobody inside that diner knew, not the gang members, not the customers, not even Maddalena herself, was that 20 years earlier, a brave little 7-year-old girl had unknowingly saved Federico's life after an assassination attempt. He had searched for answers ever since, never forgetting her face or the kindness that kept him alive. Tonight, fate had finally brought them together again. And this time, he refused to let history take her away from him. Before we begin this unforgettable story, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I'd love to see how many countries are joining us today. Please take a second to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with your family and friends if you enjoy emotional mafia stories filled with shocking twists and unforgettable moments. Maddalena Romano was 27 years old, overworked, underpaid, and exhausted. Every evening she tied on her faded black and white waitress apron, forced a tired smile onto her face, and served customers at Rossi's diner until long after midnight. She had no idea that tonight would change her life forever. Just before closing, the bell above the entrance rang softly. A tall man dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit stepped inside alone. His sharp eyes quietly scanned the room, then stopped on Maddalena. The moment she smiled politely and walked toward him with a menu. Federico Filippo recognized her instantly. Maddalena's entire body trembled as Federico finally pulled away from the kiss. Her breathing became uneven, and before she could stop herself, she shoved him backward with both hands. "Are you insane?" she snapped, wiping her lips with the back of her hand. "Who do you think you are?" Every customer inside the diner remained frozen, too afraid to move after seeing the armed men quietly leave without causing a single problem. Federico didn't answer immediately. His cold gray eyes stayed fixed on the large front window instead. Maddalena followed his gaze but saw nothing except the reflection of flashing streetlights dancing across the rain-soaked glass. She grabbed the telephone behind the counter with shaking hands. "I'm calling the police." Before her fingers could press the first number, Federico calmly reached over and lowered the receiver back into its cradle. "If you call them now," he said quietly, "they'll arrive too late." Maddalena glared at him. "Too late for what?" Federico took one slow breath before answering. "Someone has been watching you." She stared at him for several long seconds before letting out a nervous laugh. "Watching me?" she repeated. "Look around. I'm a waitress working double shifts just to pay my rent. I don't have money. I don't have enemies. Nobody even notices I exist. Federico's expression never changed. You're wrong. His voice remained calm, almost painfully calm. Someone has noticed you every single day. A chill slowly crept up Maddalena's spine. Stop it, she whispered. You're trying to scare me. Federico slowly removed a folded photograph from the inside pocket of his black suit and placed it gently on the counter. Maddalena hesitated before picking it up. Her face immediately lost its color. It was a photograph of herself leaving the diner 3 nights earlier, carrying groceries beneath an umbrella. Another showed her unlocking the tiny apartment where she lived. Another captured her sitting alone at her mother's grave only a week before. They weren't ordinary photographs. They had been taken from a distance, without her knowledge. Her heartbeat thundered inside her chest. Who took these? She whispered. Federico looked directly into her frightened eyes. The same people who walked into this diner tonight. Maddalena quickly shook her head. No. No. This isn't real. She pushed the photographs away as though touching them burned her fingers. Someone is playing a sick joke. Yet as she tried convincing herself, something strange stirred deep inside her mind. A faint memory, rain falling, the smell of old wood, blood dripping onto cold concrete, a frightened teenage boy hiding in darkness, and the tiny hands of a little girl wrapping torn cloth around his wounded arm. Maddalena suddenly grabbed her head. Why? She whispered shakily. Why does this feel familiar? A sharp pain exploded inside Maddalena's head. The diner. Federico, the photographs, everything around her slowly faded until only darkness remained. Then, like fragments of a forgotten dream, the memories returned. 20 years earlier. Chicago had been drowning beneath a violent thunderstorm. Lightning ripped across the sky as frightened 16-year-old Federico Filippo sprinted through narrow alleyways, his white shirt soaked with blood from a gunshot wound grazing his shoulder. Behind him echoed angry voices. Find him, one man shouted. The boss wants the boy dead before sunrise. Federico stumbled against a brick wall, breathing heavily. He was exhausted. Every step left drops of blood on the wet pavement. He knew he couldn't keep running much longer. Then he noticed a tiny abandoned storage shed behind an old neighborhood church. With the last of his strength, he forced the wooden door open and collapsed inside. His vision blurred. His breathing became shallow. Outside, thunder shook the ground as footsteps drew closer. Moments later, the creaking door slowly opened again. Federico reached weakly for the small knife hidden beneath his jacket, but instead of another killer, a frightened little girl stood in the doorway holding a small stuffed rabbit. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her long brown hair was damp from the rain, and her wide blue eyes filled with shock as she stared at the injured stranger lying on the dusty floor. Mister. She whispered softly. You're bleeding. Federico forced himself to speak. You have to leave, they're coming. Instead of running away, the little girl quietly knelt beside him. Without saying another word, she hurried outside and returned carrying a small bottle of water from her family's nearby house. She gently lifted his head and helped him drink. Then she looked at the blood pouring from his shoulder. Without hesitation, she grabbed the edge of her favorite yellow summer dress and ripped a long strip from the fabric. Her tiny hands carefully wrapped the cloth around Federico's wound as tightly as she could. Tears filled her eyes, but she never stopped helping. Seconds later, loud footsteps splashed through puddles outside. 3 armed assassins burst into the churchyard. One spotted the little girl stepping out of the shed. "Hey," he barked. "Have you seen a wounded teenage boy around here?" Maddalena's little heart pounded so loudly she thought they could hear it. She looked toward the shed, then slowly raised one trembling finger toward the opposite street. "He ran that way," she whispered. The killers cursed and immediately sprinted after the false trail without checking the shed. They never looked back. Hidden inside, Federico listened as their voices disappeared into the storm. For the first time that terrifying night, he realized he was going to live. Because one fearless little girl had chosen kindness over fear. Maddalena slowly lowered her trembling hands from her head and stared at Federico as though she were looking at a complete stranger, yet something inside her refused to believe he was lying. Her breathing became shallow. Tiny pieces of that rainy night flashed through her mind before disappearing again like smoke slipping through her fingers. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "I don't remember any of this." Federico remained silent for several seconds, his cold gray eyes softer than they had ever been. Then, without taking his eyes off her, he reached inside his jacket and carefully removed an old leather wallet that looked as though it had survived countless years. From one hidden pocket, he unfolded a tiny, faded piece of yellow fabric. Time had worn its color, but it was still carefully preserved. Maddalena frowned in confusion. "What's that?" she asked quietly. Federico looked down at the cloth before answering. "The bandage." Maddalena blinked. "What?" "The one you tore from your dress 20 years ago." He gently ran his thumb across the worn fabric as though it were the most valuable thing he owned. "I promised myself I'd never throw it away." Maddalena felt tears begin forming in her eyes without understanding why. "Why would you keep something like that?" Federico slowly lifted his gaze until their eyes met again. His voice remained calm. But there was unmistakable emotion hidden beneath every word. "Because that little girl gave me something nobody else did." He paused. Hope. Silence filled the diner. Even the few remaining customers watched without daring to interrupt. Federico took one slow step closer. "People remember gunshots, betrayal, pain," he said softly. "I remembered a smile." Maddalena's eyebrows drew together. "A smile?" Federico nodded. "You were terrified that night." A faint smile touched his lips. "Your tiny hands wouldn't stop shaking while you wrapped my wound, but before you left." He swallowed hard. "You smiled at me." Maddalena stared at him, completely speechless. Federico continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "You said, 'Don't be scared, mister, you'll be okay.'" His eyes glistened. Nobody had ever said those words to me before. Maddalena pressed both hands against her chest as another wave of blurred memories rushed through her mind. Rain, thunder, a frightened boy leaning against a wall, a little girl smiling despite her fear, then everything vanished again. Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I'm trying," she whispered through trembling lips. "I'm trying so hard to remember, but I can't." Her voice broke completely. "What's wrong with me?" Federico's expression softened with heartbreaking tenderness. "Nothing is wrong with you." He spoke gently, as though afraid she might shatter. "You were only 7 years old. Life kept moving, you grew up, and those memories buried themselves deep inside your heart." Maddalena covered her face as quiet sobs escaped her. She couldn't understand why hearing a stranger speak about a forgotten smile made her heart ache so deeply. But Federico understood. He had carried that smile with him every single day for 20 years, while the little girl who had given it away had forgotten it ever happened. Federico stood motionless as Maddalena struggled to steady her breathing. Every instinct he had developed after years of surviving in the brutal underworld screamed that they had already stayed in the diner far too long. He quietly glanced toward the rain-covered window. Across the street, a black SUV that had been parked there earlier was gone. Another had taken its place. Then another slowly rolled past without stopping. Federico's jaw tightened. They had found them. He reached into his jacket, removed a secure cell phone, and sent a single coded message to his most trusted men. Only 3 words appeared on the screen. "Prepare the estate." Less than 5 seconds later, his phone vibrated once. One reply. "They're already moving." Federico slowly closed his eyes. He had hoped they still had time. They didn't. Maddalena noticed the sudden change in his expression. "What is it?" she asked nervously. Federico slipped the phone back into his pocket. "We're leaving." She frowned. "Leaving?" "Federico, I still don't understand any of this." Before he could answer, another message arrived. This time, his face turned pale. The security cameras surrounding his mansion had detected more than 20 black vehicles approaching from every direction. Armed men were climbing over the outer walls. Others were cutting the estate's power lines. Someone had leaked his location. Maddalena watched the color drain from his face. "Tell me what's happening." Federico looked directly into her frightened eyes. "They know who you are now." Her heart skipped. "Who?" "The Romano family." His voice became colder than ice. "My oldest enemies." Maddalena shook her head. "Why would they care about me?" Federico answered without hesitation. "Because they watched what happened inside this diner." He paused. "The moment I risked my life to protect you." He looked away briefly before finishing. "They realized you're the only person in this world I cannot afford to lose." Maddalena felt the floor disappear beneath her feet. She had known this man for less than an hour, yet somehow she had become the weakness of the most feared Mafia boss in Chicago. Suddenly the diner's lights flickered twice before going completely dark. Every customer screamed. Outside, tires screeched across the wet pavement. Engines roared. Headlights flooded the windows like blinding white fire. Federico immediately pulled Maddalena behind an overturned table just as the front glass exploded inward. Shards rained across the floor while masked gunmen rushed toward the entrance firing automatic weapons into the ceiling. Customers dove beneath tables, crying in terror. Waitresses screamed as dishes shattered everywhere. Without a second's hesitation, Federico drew a black pistol from beneath his jacket, stepped in front of Maddalena, and fired with calm, deadly precision. 2 attackers dropped instantly while the others scattered for cover. "Stay behind me," he ordered. The firefight lasted only seconds before the surviving gunmen retreated outside. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance, forcing them to pull back. Federico didn't celebrate. He already knew this had only been the beginning. His enemies weren't trying to kill him tonight. They wanted something far more valuable. They wanted Maddalena alive. Federico drove through the pouring rain without saying a single word. The city lights disappeared behind them as the armored SUV climbed the winding road toward his heavily guarded estate. Maddalena sat beside him wrapped in silence, still shaken by the attack at the diner. She could not understand why complete strangers were willing to risk their lives just because Federico had protected her. When they finally entered the mansion, the massive steel gates slammed shut behind them. Armed guards rushed into position while security cameras rotated toward every entrance. Federico led Maddalena into a quiet library filled with old books, family portraits, and the warm glow of a crackling fireplace. For the first time that night, his hard expression softened. He walked toward an antique cabinet and carefully removed a small wooden box that looked older than both of them. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside rested a faded strip of yellow cloth. A tiny silver hair clip, and an old birthday candle burned almost to its end. Maddalena stared at the strange collection. "Why would you keep these?" she whispered. Federico picked up the yellow cloth first. "Because this saved my life." Then he held up the little silver hair clip. "You dropped this while running home after hiding me." Maddalena's breathing caught. Federico smiled sadly. "I searched for the owner for years, but all I remembered was a little girl with brave eyes and the warmest smile I'd ever seen." He looked down at the old birthday candle resting in his palm. "Every year on my birthday, I lit this candle." Maddalena frowned through her tears. "Why?" Federico swallowed hard before answering. "Because every birthday I celebrated belonged to you." His voice cracked for the first time. "If you hadn't lied to those killers, I would have died before turning 17. He looked into her eyes with heartbreaking gratitude. "So every year, before anyone sang happy birthday, I quietly thanked the little girl who gave me another year to live." Maddalena covered her mouth as tears streamed down her face. Suddenly another memory rushed into her mind with startling clarity. She saw herself running home beneath the heavy rain. Her mother asking why her favorite yellow dress was torn, her tiny silver hair clip falling into the muddy street, then turning back toward the old church one last time. Inside the broken shed, the wounded teenage boy had smiled weakly and whispered, "Thank you." Maddalena gasped loudly as every forgotten memory came flooding back. Her knees gave way beneath her, but Federico caught her before she fell. She buried her face against his chest and sobbed uncontrollably. "I remember," she cried. "Oh my God. I remember everything." Federico closed his eyes as tears finally escaped down his own face after 20 long years. He gently wrapped his arms around her, not as the feared Mafia boss everyone feared, but as the frightened 16-year-old boy whose life had once been saved by the kindness of one brave little girl. Neither of them spoke again. They simply stood there holding each other, both crying for the 20 years that fate had stolen from them. And for the miracle that had finally brought them back together. Maddalena remained in Federico's arms until the storm of emotions slowly settled into quiet sobs. Neither of them noticed how silent the mansion had become. Outside, armed guards continued patrolling the estate, their footsteps echoing across the marble courtyard, but inside the library, time itself seemed to stand still. Federico gently stepped back, wiping the tears from his face before looking at her with a sadness that reached far deeper than words. "There's something I need to tell you," he said quietly. Maddalena nodded, still unable to stop the tears flowing down her cheeks. Federico took a slow breath. "You should leave." She blinked in confusion. "What?" "Tonight." His voice remained calm. "I'll arrange everything. A new identity, a safe place, enough money that you'll never have to work another day if you don't want to. You'll disappear before sunrise, and nobody will ever find you again." Maddalena stared at him in disbelief. "You're sending me away?" Federico forced himself to nod. "It's the only way." He looked toward the rain-covered windows. "Those men won't stop hunting you now. As long as you're anywhere near me, you'll always be in danger." Maddalena lowered her eyes. For a moment neither of them spoke. Federico quietly reached into his pocket and placed a small envelope on the table. "Everything you need is inside." His voice became almost a whisper. "You saved my life once. I won't allow you to lose yours because of me." He turned away before she could see the pain on his face. If she left now, she would live. If she stayed, she would become the greatest weakness a mafia boss could ever have. Maddalena looked at the envelope, then around the magnificent library with its priceless paintings, crystal chandeliers, and endless luxury. A few days earlier she would have thought this was the kind of life people dreamed about. But now, none of it mattered. She slowly walked toward Federico. "Turn around." He hesitated before facing her. Maddalena looked directly into his eyes, no longer seeing the ruthless man whose name terrified Chicago. She saw something completely different. She saw the frightened 16-year-old boy bleeding alone in an abandoned shed, a lonely teenager who had survived because one little girl chose kindness over fear, a man who had carried gratitude in his heart for 20 years without expecting anything in return. Her eyes filled with tears once more. "Do you know what I see when I look at you?" Federico remained silent. Maddalena smiled through her tears. "I don't see the most feared mafia boss in Chicago." She gently reached for his hand. "I see the lonely boy who spent 20 years thanking a little girl he thought he'd never see again." Federico's breathing caught. Maddalena picked up the envelope, then quietly placed it back into his hand. "I'm not staying because you're rich." She shook her head. "Money can't make someone protect a stranger for 20 years. Her voice became stronger with every word. "I'm staying because behind everyone else is fear. I found the kindest heart I've ever known." Federico stood frozen, unable to speak. For the first time in years, someone had looked beyond the legend, beyond the violence, beyond the expensive suits and dangerous reputation, and simply seen Federico. Not the mafia boss, just the man. He gently squeezed her hand, and in that silent moment, both of them understood that this decision would change their lives forever. Neither of them could turn back now. The quiet moment between Federico and Maddalena lasted only a few seconds before the sharp sound of an alarm shattered the silence. Red emergency lights began flashing across the mansion as a security guard's voice crackled through the intercom. Boss, we've lost the east cameras, someone's cutting through the outer fence. Federico's expression hardened instantly. Every trace of warmth disappeared from his face as years of survival instinct took over. He turned toward Maddalena. Stay here. Lock the door behind me. No matter what happens, don't open it unless you hear my voice. Maddalena grabbed his arm before he could leave. Please don't go alone. Federico gently cupped her face and forced a reassuring smile that never reached his eyes. I have to. They're here because of me. Without another word, he disappeared into the hallway. Seconds later, gunfire erupted outside. The entire mansion shook as explosions echoed across the grounds. Guards shouted orders while bullets shattered windows throughout the estate. Maddalena's heart pounded wildly inside the locked library. She tried covering her ears, but the terrifying sounds only grew louder. Then, complete silence. Too much silence. Before she could move, the lights suddenly went out. The room fell into darkness. A cold voice spoke from behind her. Looking for Federico? Maddalena gasped and spun around. A tall man stepped from the shadows wearing an expensive charcoal suit, his silver hair perfectly combed, his smile calm, almost grandfatherly. Yet his eyes held nothing but cruelty. Behind him stood 4 armed men aiming their weapons directly at her. Who are you? Maddalena whispered. The man smiled politely. Warren Romano. He gave a slight bow. Unfortunately, I'm the man responsible for ruining your peaceful little life. Maddalena backed away until her legs touched the bookshelf. Federico will find me. Warren chuckled softly. Of course he will. He slowly walked closer. That's exactly why you're coming with me. Before Maddalena could scream, one of the men covered her mouth while another restrained her arms. She fought desperately, kicking, biting, struggling with every ounce of strength she had, but they overpowered her within seconds. As they dragged her through a hidden passage beneath the mansion, she caught one last glimpse of the burning estate through a broken window. Outside, Federico was still exchanging gunfire with dozens of attackers, completely unaware that the real assault had never been aimed at him. It had been aimed at her. Minutes later, Maddalena was thrown into the back of a black armored SUV. The doors slammed shut, and the convoy disappeared into the darkness before Federico's men could stop them. By the time Federico rushed back inside the mansion, calling Maddalena's name again and again, the library was empty. Only the silver hair clip she had unknowingly dropped onto the floor remained. Federico picked it up with trembling fingers. His breathing became uneven. This is my fault, he whispered, his voice breaking. I should have gotten her away from me. Just then, his secure phone vibrated. An unknown number appeared on the screen. Federico answered without hesitation. A calm, chilling voice spoke first. Good evening, Federico. Warren laughed quietly. The girl is safe, for now. Federico's grip tightened around the phone. If you hurt her. Warren interrupted him. You'll do exactly as I say if you ever want to see her alive again. Silence followed before Warren delivered his demand. Surrender yourself, come alone, and bring every document that could destroy my empire. Refuse, and the next time Maddalena sees you, it'll be through the bars of her prison cell, if she's still alive. The call ended. Federico slowly lowered the phone, his heart consumed by guilt. The woman who had once saved his life had now been stolen because she chose to stay by his side. And he swore, no matter the cost, he would bring her home. Federico stood alone in the middle of the ruined library, the silver hair clip still clutched tightly in his trembling hand. Around him, shattered glass covered the marble floor, smoke drifted through the broken windows, and the voices of his wounded guards echoed from outside. Every instinct inside him screamed for revenge. He wanted Warren Romano dead. He wanted every man responsible to pay for touching Maddalena. But as he looked at the tiny silver hair clip, another memory returned. A frightened little girl standing in the rain, smiling through her own fear while whispering, "You'll be okay, mister." Federico slowly closed his eyes. "No," he whispered. "Not revenge. Maddalena comes first." He reached for his pistol, loaded a fresh magazine, and slipped the old hair clip safely into the inside pocket above his heart. Then, without waiting for backup or calling his remaining soldiers, he climbed into a black armored SUV and drove alone into the darkness. 2 hours later, he arrived outside an abandoned steel factory on the edge of the city. The enormous building stood surrounded by armed guards, watchtowers, floodlights, and black SUVs. Warren clearly expected an army. Instead, only one man stepped from the vehicle. Federico adjusted his black suit, his cold gray eyes never leaving the factory entrance. One guard laughed into his radio. "Boss, he actually came alone." The laughter ended the instant Federico moved. Within seconds, the first guard collapsed silently. The second never had time to raise his weapon. Federico advanced through the compound like a shadow, using every lesson the brutal Mafia world had forced him to learn. Alarms suddenly blared across the factory as dozens of gunmen rushed from every direction. Bullets ripped through the darkness. Sparks exploded from steel beams. Federico fought his way forward with calm precision, refusing to slow down no matter how many enemies stood in his path. Deep inside the factory, Maddalena sat tied to a metal chair, her wrists bruised, her heart refusing to surrender hope. Then she heard it, distant gunfire growing closer, men shouting in panic, footsteps running in every direction. A frightened guard burst into the room. "He's here," he shouted. "Federico's inside." Before another word could be spoken, the heavy steel door exploded inward. Federico appeared through the smoke. His suit torn, blood running down one side of his face, but his eyes searched only for one person. "Maddalena," he called. Relief flooded her face. "Federico." He crossed the room without hesitation, ignoring the remaining gunmen firing at him. He cut the ropes binding her wrists, pulled her into his arms, and quickly checked her injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She shook her head, tears filling her eyes. "You came." Federico smiled softly despite the chaos around them. "I promised I'd bring you home." Just then, Warren Romano appeared on an upper walkway overlooking the factory floor. He slowly applauded, wearing the same calm smile as always. "How touching," he called down. Federico instinctively reached for his pistol, but before he could aim, Maddalena grabbed his arm. "Please, don't." He looked into her tearful eyes and understood immediately. If he chased Warren now, Maddalena would be left exposed again. Without another second of hesitation, Federico lowered his weapon, wrapped one protective arm around her shoulders, and led her toward the exit. Warren watched them disappear before quietly stepping into a waiting helicopter waiting beyond the rooftop. As the aircraft lifted into the night sky, his voice echoed through the loudspeakers one final time. "Enjoy your victory, Federico, because this war has only just begun." Federico looked up briefly, then turned away. Warren had escaped. But for Federico, saving Maddalena had always mattered more than revenge. The last of Warren Romano's men charged through the factory with desperate determination, hoping to buy their boss enough time to disappear into the night. Federico gently guided Maddalena behind a thick steel pillar before turning back toward the gunfire. His expression was calm, almost frighteningly calm. He no longer fought with anger. He fought with purpose. One after another, the remaining attackers fell until the deafening gunfire slowly faded into silence. The factory became still except for the distant sound of police sirens growing closer. Federico lowered his weapon and took a slow breath. The battle was over. Warren had escaped, but his empire had suffered a crushing defeat. Federico immediately turned away from the fallen enemies without giving them another glance. Nothing else mattered. Maddalena stepped out from behind the pillar, her eyes filling with tears the moment she saw him walking toward her. His expensive black suit was torn. His hands were covered in blood. A fresh cut ran across his forehead. Yet despite everything he had endured, the first thing he asked was, "Are you all right?" Maddalena nodded through her tears. She reached out and gently touched his bruised face as though making sure he was truly standing before her. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Then Federico slowly took both of her trembling hands into his own. His gray eyes met hers with a warmth she had never seen before. His voice was quiet, almost breaking. 20 years ago, everyone saw a wounded stranger. He paused, struggling to hold back his emotions. "Only one little girl believed I deserved to live." Tears rolled freely down Maddalena's cheeks. Federico smiled through tears of his own. "You saved my life." His voice cracked. "Tonight, I finally repaid my debt." Before another word could be spoken, Maddalena threw her arms around him and held him as tightly as she could. Federico embraced her just as firmly. There were no grand speeches, no promises, no dramatic declarations. Only two people standing quietly in the middle of a broken factory, crying for everything they had lost, and for everything fate had finally returned to them after 20 long years. Sometimes gratitude becomes love, and sometimes one small act of kindness becomes the reason another heart keeps beating. As the first rays of sunrise poured through the shattered factory windows, Federico and Maddalena walked toward the light together, no longer bound by a debt, but united by a second chance neither of them had ever expected. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and tell me your favorite moment in Federico and Maddalena's journey. If you enjoyed this emotional Mafia story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves unforgettable stories about courage, sacrifice, and second chances. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and always remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever. Sometimes one small act of kindness becomes the reason another heart keeps beating. As the first rays of sunrise poured through the shattered factory windows, Federico and Maddalena walked toward the light together, no longer bound by a debt, but united by a second chance neither of them had ever expected. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and tell me your favorite moment in Federico and Maddalena's journey. If you enjoyed this emotional Mafia story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves unforgettable stories about courage, sacrifice, and second chances. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and always remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever. Sometimes one small act of kindness becomes the reason another heart keeps beating. As the first rays of sunrise poured through the shattered factory windows, Federico and Maddalena walked toward the light together, no longer bound by a debt, but united by a second chance neither of them had ever expected. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and tell me your favorite moment in Federico and Maddalena's journey. If you enjoyed this emotional Mafia story, please like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves unforgettable stories about courage, sacrifice, and second chances. Until next time, thank you so much for watching, and always remember, sometimes the smallest act of kindness can change two lives forever.